The heart-pounding echoes of my hurried footsteps reverberated through the desolate streets, marking my desperate attempt to reach the sanctuary of my apartment. A chilling breeze swept through the alleyways, carrying with it the ominous silence of a city shrouded in slumber. My mind raced, replaying the unsettling encounter that had just transpired. As I approached my apartment building, I felt a surge of relief mingled with trepidation. I had managed to elude the stranger who had accosted me just moments earlier, but the fear lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling slightly. With a heavy sigh, I stepped through the entrance and into the familiar confines of the building. The warm, dim glow of the overhead lights cast a comforting aura, lulling me into a false sense of security. I made my way to the elevator, eager to reach the sanctuary of my apartment. As the elevator doors silently slid open, I stepped inside and turned to face the control panel. Suddenly, I sensed a presence behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head to see a tall, hooded figure standing in the doorway. The stranger wore a deep red hoodie that concealed his features, save for a pair of piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. He fixed me with an unsettling stare, his expression devoid of emotion. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Did I startle you?" I nodded silently, unable to tear my gaze away from his. "I apologize," he continued. "Which floor are you heading to?" My mind raced, trying to assess the situation. "Fear not at me," but I managed to force out the words, "Floor 15. Without making eye contact, he reached forward and pressed the button for the 15th floor, as well as the one below it. The doors slid shut, and the elevator lurched into motion. Silence filled the confined space as we ascended, the air thick with tension. I instinctively retreated to the far corner of the elevator, putting as much distance between myself and the stranger as possible. Seconds turned into an eternity as the elevator continued its ascent. I could feel the stranger's gaze fixed on me, its intensity making my skin crawl. I tried to distract myself by looking at the numbers on the control panel, but my mind refused to cooperate. Finally, the elevator reached the floor below mine and the doors slid open. The stranger stepped out slowly, his movements deliberate and menacing. He turned to face me, his blue eyes gleaming in the dim light. For a moment, he simply stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, with a swift and fluid motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, silver knife. Fear surged through me as I realized his true intentions. I screamed and lunged towards the control panel, desperately trying to open the doors. But it was too late. The stranger's eyes flashed with a cruel gleam as he raised the knife and lunged at me. I screamed again as I felt the cold blade slice through my skin. Pain exploded in my chest, blinding me. In the haze of agony, I watched as the stranger stepped back, his face contorted into a grotesque mask of satisfaction. The elevator doors slowly began to close, revealing a glimpse of him turning and heading towards the upper floors. As darkness enveloped me, I knew that my fate was sealed. I had fallen victim to the heartless predator who had stalked me through the shadows. My last thoughts were of my loved ones and the life that had been so cruelly taken from me. In the aftermath of that fateful night, the stranger disappeared without a trace. The police conducted a thorough investigation, but no arrests were ever made. The mystery of my death remains unsolved, a dark and haunting reminder of the evil that can lurk in our midst. Darkness enveloped the small, somber house like a suffocating blanket, its oppressive weight settling upon our hearts as we embraced the night. My family, burdened by the weight of recent tragedy, had sought refuge within these haunted walls, each of us carrying our own silent burden of grief. The specter of my uncle, whose life had ended abruptly in this very house, lingered like an unseen presence, casting an ominous shadow over our makeshift home. On that fateful night, my sister and I found ourselves huddled together in the confines of our cramped bedroom, seeking solace in the dim glow of the television screen. The hour was late, past the witching hour, as the clock ticked relentlessly towards the darkest part of the night. The air crackled with an eerie stillness, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of video game consoles and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Suddenly, our refuge was shattered by an unexpected sound. A sharp rap echoed from beyond our bedroom door, startling us both. We exchanged anxious glances, our hearts pounding a rapid tattoo in our chests. Questions raced through our minds. Who could be knocking at this ungodly hour? Why were they here? Who is it? My sister whispered, her voice trembling. Silence met our inquiry, amplifying our apprehension. Another knock, more insistent this time, reverberated through the house. Our breaths caught in our throats as the doorknob slowly rotated, its movement sending a shiver down our spines. I swallowed hard, summoning a semblance of courage. "Come in," I managed to croak. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but an empty hallway shrouded in darkness. A gust of icy air swept through the room, carrying with it an unsettling chill. I cautiously approached the threshold, my hand fumbling for the light switch. With a soft click, the hallway illuminated, but to my dismay, it remained vacant. "Mom?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. "Is that you?" Only silence answered me. I could hear my own heartbeat throbbing in my ears, a relentless drumbeat of fear. Slowly, I made my way down the hallway, checking each room as I went. My mother and sisters were all fast asleep, oblivious to the disturbance that had sent shivers down my spine. As I returned to our bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The air seemed heavy with an oppressive presence, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I glanced back at the empty hallway, its darkness seeming to writhe and shift. Suddenly, my gaze was drawn to a faint glow emanating from the end of the hall. Curiosity and trepidation warred within me as I cautiously approached the source of the light. As I drew closer, I realized that it was coming from beneath the door of my uncle's room, the room where he had taken his own life. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Fear gnawed at me, whispering insidious suggestions, but an insatiable need to know compelled me forward. With trembling fingers, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The stench of stale air and decay filled my nostrils as I stepped into the room. Cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling, and dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the window. A single beam of moonlight illuminated a large bloodstain on the carpet, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded here. I scanned the room, my eyes darting nervously from one object to the next. Everything was as my mother had described: the bed unmade, clothes strewn across the floor, a half-empty bottle of pills on the nightstand. But something was not right. As my gaze fell upon the bed, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I approached the bed and pulled back the covers. There, lying motionless on the blood-stained sheets, was the body of my uncle. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. His skin was pale and cold to the touch. A gasp escaped my lips as I realized that this was not a ghost or a figment of my imagination, but the lifeless remains of my beloved family member. Terror surged through me like a tidal wave, threatening to consume me whole. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape the horrors of that room. As I reached the doorway, I cast one last glance at my uncle's lifeless form. His eyes seemed to bore into me, accusingly, as if he were blaming me for his untimely demise. With a strangled cry, I fled the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I ran down the hallway and into the living room, where I collapsed on the couch, trembling uncontrollably. My sister, awakened by the commotion, rushed to my side. "What's wrong? What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I could barely speak, my words choked with sobs. "Uncle, he..." I couldn't bring myself to finish the sentence. My sister's eyes widened in horror as she pieced together the fragments of my incoherent ramblings. Together, we sat in stunned silence, the weight of what we had witnessed settling upon our young minds. As the night wore on, my family gathered in the living room, each of us grappling with the shattering revelation. My mother held me close, her tears mingling with mine. We whispered words of comfort and support, trying to make sense of the senseless tragedy that had befallen us. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the darkness gradually gave way to dawn. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the cracks in the curtains, a glimmer of hope began to flicker within us. We had survived the night, and together we would face whatever the future held. The following days were a blur of police reports, funeral arrangements, and whispered conversations. The house that had once been a place of refuge became a constant reminder of the darkness that had consumed my uncle. We stayed only as long as we had to, until we could find a new home, a place where we could start over, free from the haunting memories of the past. But even as we left that cursed house behind, the scars remained. My uncle's suicide and the subsequent events that unfolded within those walls left an indelible mark on our lives. We had faced our fears, confronted the darkness, and emerged from the wreckage as stronger individuals. The house may have stood empty, but the legacy of my uncle's tragedy would live on, a cautionary tale whispered among the locals. And as time passed, the legend of the haunted house on the hill would be passed down through generations, a grim reminder that even in the darkness, there is always hope to be found. I was a nurse, a palliative care nurse, trained to ease the suffering of those in their final moments. But at St. Bartholomew's, easing the suffering of the living was a constant battle against the ghosts of the past. It was an institution shrouded in secrets, a sprawling, decaying edifice with an unsettling history. The whispers started on my first day. The senior nurses, haggard women who had toiled in its halls for decades, recounted chilling tales of the building's past. Before it was a nursing home, it had been an orphanage. The children, they'd say with a morbid gleam in their eyes, were buried in the rose garden. The rose garden, a tangle of overgrown blooms and fragrant thorns, existed under a newer wing of the building. It was a place I avoided, a place where the ghosts were rumored to be most active. The nightmares came first. Faces, pale and drawn, would haunt my sleep, children with wide, accusing eyes, their whispers echoing in the darkness. Then came the first encounter. It was a sweltering August night. The air conditioner coughed and sputtered, a weak defense against the oppressive heat. I was making my rounds, checking vitals, administering medication, soothing the anxious breaths of the elderly. Mr. Peterson, a frail man with a kind heart, was in his final hours. As I tucked the blanket around him, his eyes suddenly snapped open, clear and sharp. "Please," he rasped, his voice barely audible, "tell the little girl to get out of my room." His words hung in the air, a chilling echo in the silence. I had heard whispers stories, but this was different. This was real. An icy shiver ran down my spine. "Mr. Pearson," I said softly, "there's no one in your room. It's just me." His gaze, a mix of pleading and terror, stayed locked on a point in the corner of the room, invisible to me. "Please," he begged, his voice growing weaker. "She's standing by the window, she won't leave me alone." I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. This wasn't the fog of impending death, this was something else. Something unnerving and unsettling. I excused myself, my skin crawling with cold sweat, and found another nurse, Jane, who had been at St. Bartholomew's almost as long as the building had stood. "Jane," I whispered, pulling her aside, "we need to check on Mr. Peterson. He's hallucinating." She nodded, a practiced frown etched onto her features. "He's gone, bless his soul." The news offered no comfort. Jane told me with a tired, knowing sigh, his mind was always a bit fragile. Old age does that to a man. "But you know those stories about the little girl, right?" She gave me a look, her eyes dark and knowing. "The one they used to bury in the rose garden?" "Yeah," she whispered, her voice dropping to a near inaudible hushed tone. "It's funny, they always seem to find their way back." Funny wasn't the word I'd use. It was terrifying. A fear that burrowed under my skin and made my pulse quicken. This became a recurring nightmare. Every few weeks, an elderly patient, on their deathbed, would ask, in the dead of night, to be rid of a ghost child. An old woman in the dementia ward would demand that the little boy in the corner stop staring at her. Each time, the same chilling plea, the same unnerving sensation, The same icy fear that gripped my heart. It wasn't just me either. Other nurses confirmed that they had experienced the same. They would tell tales in the break room, hushed whispers in the dim light of the coffee machine, a nervous laughter hiding a deeper unease. We never mentioned it to the administration, afraid of ridicule, afraid of being dismissed as weak or superstitious. One night, a particularly cold and dreary October evening, it happened again. A young woman new to the staff, her face pale and trembling, approached me. "There's something in Mrs. Johnson's room," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's a little boy with red shoes. He won't leave her alone." Mrs. Johnson was a kind woman with a soft voice and a warm smile. She had Alzheimer's, and in the last days of her life, she seemed to have lost her fear of the darkness. I gripped the flashlight in my hand, feeling a familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. We followed the young nurse, all of us hesitant, as if venturing into a place where we knew we shouldn't go. Mrs. Johnson was asleep, a small, frail figure beneath the thin cotton sheets. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and lavender. The young nurse pointed her own flashlight towards the corner, her fingers trembling. "There," she whispered. "There he is." There wasn't anything there. The corner was empty, the shadows playing tricks on our eyes, creating illusions in the half-light. But despite the absence of any real presence, a cold air seemed to gather in the corner, sending shivers down my spine. "She says he's laughing," the young nurse choked out, her voice barely a whisper. I felt a chill run through me as I noticed Mrs. Johnson's face, contorted in a grimace, her lips moving soundlessly as if she was actually trying to speak. I took a step back, the knot in my stomach tightening. "Maybe we should just let her sleep." The words seemed hollow even as I said them. My eyes lingered on the corner of the room, the shadow stretching and twisting, the scent of lavender replaced by the musty scent of something old, something damp, something dead. The faintest sound of children's laughter, indistinguishable from the wind howling outside, seemed to echo from the depths of the building. We left Mrs. Johnson's room, leaving her to her sleep or whatever else might be in her room with her. It was a silent, unspoken agreement, a line we wouldn't cross. The next day, we learned that Mrs. Johnson had passed, peacefully in her sleep. But the terror, the chilling sense of the unseen, lingered. I often wondered what the children had experienced, what kind of a horror had led them to the rose garden, to their tragic silence. The royal inquiry into St. Bartholomew's was a long time coming. The truth, like the ghosts that haunted the building, refused to be silenced. And the stories, the whispers, they would never leave, forever echoing from the depths of the building's ancient walls, a chilling reminder of the past that continued to haunt the present. We left St. Bartholomew's after a while, all of us, driven away by the fear that clawed at our throats, by the shadows that never seemed to leave the corner of our eyes. We carried the memories, the secrets of the building, buried deep within our souls. And often, in the dead of night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of children's laughter echoing in my ears, a chill crawling down my spine, a reminder of the ghosts that never seemed to leave. The ghosts that lingered in the building, and in our hearts.